Hi everybody, again welcome to our webinar about modern attacks on Azure AD workloads. Today we will discuss potential modern attacks on cloud services and provide a demo where we will demonstrate this within an environment that is vulnerable to such attacks. We also discuss detect capabilities by using Azure AD Identity Protection, and we are lucky today to have some members from the Azure Identity Protection team of Microsoft with us today to discuss these new capabilities. We will recording today's session and share with you in the upcoming days. Please feel free to submit any questions in the chat window. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar where we will try to answer all of those questions, all of your questions. So I hand it over to Thomas now so he can start with a short introduction. So Thomas, take it away.
Thanks, Bram, and welcome everybody. So let me just quickly take over the screen. And thank you for taking the time and liberty for coming to today's session. So my name is Thomas. I'm the CEO and founder of Nedscaper. Some of you might know, but Nedscaper is actually a word derived from the two places right here, Amsterdam and Cape Town, making it Nedscaper, with a small wink to the old browser, which once upon a day also invented SSL 1.0. So today's session will be going deeply into the new Azure Active Directory identity-driven attacks, and obviously how to detect and mitigate those risks. Thank you, Etan and the Azure AD team for being with us today. And thank you for taking all the time and efforts in the couple of weeks and even months, I think, when we jointly worked on this. So small slide of the Nedscaper team right here, Derk, Raymond, and Bram in the call here, and Massimo visiting the Israel team with Blue Hat just last month. So obviously, we as Nedscaper, we do two things. One is we drive E5 security and Azure security on professional services. And secondly, we do a 24/7 managed detect and respond, where these are the key elements to our capability. And I think the most important element of it all is the integrated and holistic power of the Microsoft product stack. So by combining those E5 security products for EDR, for mail defense, for identity detections, together with a cloud-native SIEM like Microsoft Sentinel, it really gives you that integrated and holistic monitoring capability for detecting today's modern threats. One, I think, abbreviation I usually make is that you see that today's modern assumed breach threat landscape is really about assuming breach. And understanding you need to have defense in depth and have detect capabilities on your edge and on your perimeter. Talking about the word perimeter, perimeter isn't only a verb you use in networking anymore. It's really identity and endpoint being the new parameter in today's hybrid world. When you think of chess, actually, I think it really makes sense to start of sort of playing the chess game and understanding that it's okay to lose a pawn. It's okay to maybe, have some attacks and maybe even have a device which might be compromised, which could be a laptop or a desktop, right? But it's really up to detecting your crown jewels, detecting your assets, and making sure they don't get in deeper. So with that, I'll give it over to Etan. And Etan, I think you're going to take over the screen through Bram. So break a leg and best of luck.
Thanks, Thomas, and yeah, thanks to the entire Nedscaper team and all of you for joining. This is a great opportunity for us. My name is Etan Basseri. I'm a product manager in the Azure AD Identity Protection team based out of Redmond. I'm joined by my colleague Winston Howard, who's one of our engineers. So yeah, Raymond or Bram, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we'll go ahead and pull it up. One of the things I'd like to do today is share some of the threats that we're seeing, some of the most common and pervasive threats that we're seeing against this particular type of identity, and then go through some of the system defenses that we've started to put in place. And then the Nedscaper team is going to take you through some simulations and explain some of the details behind it. So to get started, let's think about the attack vectors. Now, for those of you who are familiar with identity compromise in general, you're probably familiar with things like password spray attacks, other brute force attacks, and of course, replay attacks. The idea of you have some database breach, the passwords are leaked into plain text, and all of a sudden, all of these passwords, which we know get reused from system to system, get replayed. The attacks for identities for applications and workloads is a little bit different. One example would be the idea of open repositories, public repositories that have an application secret or password inside them. This is subject to a replay attack, and we have seen this happen. So it's like the same category of replay attack, but happening in a different way. Another example is consent phishing. Consent phishing is where a malicious application is pretending to be a legitimate application, and the victim end user is tricked into clicking some link, which then installs the application in their local Azure AD tenant. And that, as a result, can be the initial foothold, or it can just be one stop on the attack path towards getting others to consent. And once application consent is achieved, then the malicious application will often be able to read mail, read SharePoint, other sorts, get access basically to the sensitive resources, to the valuable information that the adversary is after. The final example, the SolarWinds, or what we call SolarGate event that happened about a year and a half ago, or it was discovered about a year and a half ago, is actually a far more complex attack, and it involves hybrid infrastructure, it involves application compromise, a bunch of things. But the reason I bring it up is because it was one of the cases where we saw legitimate applications taken over. And one of those methods that was used was to add a credential to a service principal. So what happens there is that the application actually doesn't break when you add a credential. An application can have many credentials associated with it, in the same way that a user could have a password and FIDO, and like you could have like Windows Hello for Business, which is FIDO. You could have a security key, which is FIDO. So you could have multiple credentials. The application's the same way. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about some of the details. Now, the first thing to understand here is that as you are thinking about how workload identities can be at risk, there's really three main categories. The first one is the aspect of a compromised application. It's a legitimate application that has been hijacked. This is important because the path to remediation is going to be unique here as opposed to others. If the application is compromised, truly compromised, you're going to need to do an actual investigation to understand what was the full spectrum of all of the impact of this attack, and you're going to want to get this application back to a healthy state. That's different than in this case of a malicious application. We took the case of a consent phishing campaign. If the application is malicious, it's never going to be remediated, brought back to a healthy state. What needs to be done is shut down and removed. And in fact, Microsoft monitors for malicious applications as well, and we should do global takedowns of malicious applications on a regular basis. But at the same time, we want our customers to be vigilant of this. Finally, the aspect of a misconfigured application. There are cases where we might not have specific evidence of compromise, but we might find an application that is so badly configured, such as having a credential pasted in plain text in a public GitHub repository, just to give you one example, where we treat it as compromised. We assume breach in Zero Trust. And because we assume breach, we want customers to take action as if it were breach, which means you're rolling that credential and doing an investigation to make sure that that application wasn't abused by an adversary. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to share with you three very simplified attack graphs. These are deliberately simplified for the purposes of this talk. Sometimes the attacks have been more sophisticated, but the purpose of this is illustrative to give you a sense of what are the nature of the attacks and what are the sort of techniques, tactics, and procedures that you might see an adversary carry out. Now, with the first case I shared with you, the compromised application, in this case, typically there's a cloud admin that is compromised. That might be a global admin or application admin or some other admin. And then through impersonation of that admin, they will add the credentials to the existing application. This is that one I mentioned with the SolarGate event. Now, again, adding the credentials to the existing application does not interrupt the operation of the application. It simply allows the attacker to obfuscate their activity, to hide their activity, and to continue to move laterally throughout the organization. And through impersonating that application, they'll have access to the APIs. Usually, they'll take an application that has appropriate permissions or roles to access some sensitive resources. If I go to the next example, the aspect of a malicious app. So typically we'll see this starting with a phishing email. There are other ways that it can happen. In the SolarWinds example, the adversary was already in the victim environments and they instantiated a malicious app, but a lot of the time we see phishing emails. And that phishing email will trick the user into consenting to that application. And the application, through that consent, can actually impersonate the user and access whatever resources that user has access to. One alternative path is for that phishing, that malicious application to impersonate the initial user to phish other users, right? Because we have trust typically in our organizations. If Winston sends me a link, I'm typically going to click on it. So this is a way that consent phishing attacks often spread within an organization. And in the final example, we have the example of a misconfigured application. So what happens is an attacker can scan for a plain text credential in a public repository and then impersonate that application directly to enumerate the directory and find out what roles this particular application or what permissions this application has in the directory, because you can do that from anywhere on the internet. And then again, call the APIs, access the resources to get in and do whatever it is their objective is. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what the threats are that we're dealing with at a high level. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what is Azure AD Identity Protection. Fundamentally, Azure AD Identity Protection is a system designed to detect risk within an organization. And what I mean by that is we are protecting, detecting, and remediating compromised identities at several different stages. When we discuss risk, we're talking about what is the likelihood that a bad actor has knowledge or control of that identity's credentials and might be using it for a nefarious purpose. So the heart of it is really the signals that we get. The signals here on the far right, on the left, can be one of three things. They can be auto-generated, meaning that we use machine learning algorithms to guess based off of known attack patterns whether an application is compromised. So one example would be password spray. We know what password spray looks like because we see so many logins. By the way, we have over 400 million active users on the system. So we learn from these 400 million users and find out what normal looks like. We also have expert-generated detection. So that's where we have teams of security researchers, both in our division and in other partner divisions, such as Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, to tell us when particular accounts are compromised. We also have end-user generated. This is where you, our customers, can actually tell us through our portal, through our APIs, when one of your users is compromised. So we learn from all of this. And what we do is we actually give you the capabilities to lock down these areas of compromise for users, for those user-specific sign-ins, and for workload identities. Those can be done in a few ways, but fundamentally, it's all about conditional access. Some of you have probably heard of conditional access. Conditional access is a policy-based engine that allows you to essentially make access control decisions with an if-then statement. So at its simplest, it would be if a user is high risk because of, let's say, a password spray attack, then I want you to block access to that account. If a user is medium risk, let's say because they're using a Tor browser, then maybe I want conditional access to challenge this user with multi-factor authentication. These are the types of controls that you can use in combination between identity protection, which is the risk detection engine, and conditional access, which is our access control tool. Now, we talked about the CA policies. There's also ways for you to get this risk information separate from access control. There's also key ways for you to get this risk information other than the Azure portal. You can use Graph. You can do an integration between Azure Monitor or Azure Sentinel, and you can route these alerts into your third-party SIEM tool. The purpose of having all of this is so you have a flexible way of getting the risk data the way you need it. Let's go to the next slide, and I want to just explain a little bit about the hierarchy before I hand it off. Now, there's basically a taxonomy or a hierarchy between the way we think about individual detections and account risk. So at the top, you have the idea of a risky user. All risk for a given account applies to this user. And it can be in one of two ways. It could be an individual risk detection. So at the bottom, you see the idea of a risk event. So that's the example of finding a leaked credential, seeing an unfamiliar sign-in event, seeing a potential anomalous token event where there might be a token theft. Again, the password spray attack I shared. These are all individual detections. Each one of those things can roll up to user risk. But there are also cases where we can attack real-time sign-in risk, meaning within milliseconds, our system can detect that a particular sign-in is risky because of, usually because of an unfamiliar sign-in property. We can detect that immediately, and we can apply conditional access to sign-in risk. So within milliseconds, our system can detect an anomaly and then enforce an access control policy based on whatever you configure. So that's how user risk works today. This has been around for several years. It's quite mature. Shifting gears over to workload identities. Workload identities is a fairly new concept, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we don't have the sign-in risk aspect yet. We have individual detections, and we have account risk, workload identity. So the individual detections would be things like a leaked credential, or suspicious sign-ins, or the anomalous addition of a credential to an OAuth application. These are the types of detections that we have right now. We'll continue to add more in the future. But what's important to understand is that one or more of these events rolls up and aggregates at the account level for that individual workload identity. And that's how we compute it. So to recap, detections are the individual events that you see on the bottom row. Those are the individual events. Risky users and risky workload identities are the account level risk states. Let me hand it off to Derek to share a little bit more detail with you. Sorry, Raymond.
Yes, thank you, Etan. So I'm going to take the screen. So before we dive into the demonstration itself, I want to explain what the attack and what I'm performing during the demonstration. So for the attack, obviously there's an attacker. In this case, it's me, and there's Azure. So what I'm going to do as an attacker is I'm going to scan a GitHub repository for leaked credentials. And in this example, I'm finding credentials for a service principal. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those leaked credentials and I'm going to authenticate to Azure. Once I'm authenticated to Azure, as an attacker, you need to know which resources within Azure the service principal has authorization to. So with a single command in the example, you can see I have access to a key vault. And what I'm going to do is, for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to extract the key, the value of the key, which is in the key vault. Obviously, in the example, it's the key vault. It can be a database. It can be anything that the service principal has access to, basically. So an application, code, or whatsoever. So that's the high-level overview of the attack itself. And I'm going to share another screen. So here I'm sharing PowerShell. It's a tool which I created myself, but it's basically scanning a repository for leaked credentials, in this case, AAD secret. So it scans a repository, which is done on the internet 24/7. And here you can see I found an application ID and a secret which comes with the application ID and a tenant where I can authenticate to. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to authenticate to the tenant using the service principal. And once I'm authenticated, I want to check which resources I have access to. So simple command get AZ resource. You can see in this case, the service principal has access to a key vault. So I can connect to the key vault. And then I can extract the secret. So there's a key vault called AAD-webinar. There's a secret called super secrets, and I'm just getting the value of the secret. And in this case, it's a password, which attackers can use to pivot or to escalate their privileges or whatsoever. So basically done 4 steps: scanning the GitHub for leaked credentials. In this case, it's the service principal. Use the credentials to authenticate to Azure. The next step was to see which I'm authorized for using the service principal. and extracting a secret from the key vault. So that's basically the attack. Then up to you, Derk.
So let me share my screen. This will be the final screen we will share. So now let's talk about the Azure AD Identity Protection Workload Detection. First of all, quick recap. In Azure AD, we have app registrations, which basically is the application object, the schema of the applications, and we have the enterprise application, which is the instance within a tenant, can also be in target tenants, and that's a service principal. And like Raymond mentioned, you can set permissions with the service principal on key vault, storage accounts, etc. Now, the detection we are about to discuss today is the leak credentials in GitHub. So leak credentials in GitHub, Microsoft will scan GitHub repos for credentials, application ID, and a secret. When an application ID and a secret is found, it is matched against the Azure AD, and it's a hash match. So it's not in clear text, the hash is matched, same as the leak credentials for the user identities. So when it's seen in the system, it's you have two ways to look at it from the portal perspective. So let's do a quick demo on that. So this is the enterprise application part. And going back quickly, this is the app registration, and this is the one Raymond used to do his demo. So in identity protection, we have basically two new sections. The first is risky workload identities, and you can see all the workloads that got a risk detected. Now going to the risk detections itself, we have user detections and we have workload identity detections. By selecting workload identity detections, I can, for example, click an alert, and within the alert, I can find the details. Now, with additional info, you will be redirected to the public GitHub repo where the credentials were found. So here you can see the app ID and the application secret. So this is the new detection by Azure ID Identity Protection workload identities. Now, what can we else do with those types of information? What we can do, for example, if we go to Sentinel, so I'll quickly show you the basics. So what I first did was in the Azure Active Directory data connector, select the AAD service principal sign-in logs, and with those logs, I can do some nice things. Now, for example, I did this morning created a quick test logging on from a malicious IP address. So this was the IP address. And if you go to, for example, Azure Active Directory, you can see in the sign-in logs that this was the IP address I logged on from. So within Sentinel, what you can do is, for example, create a very simple rule. This one, service principal logged on outside of the Netherlands, because most of our users are logging on from the Netherlands. And with this rule, I get an alert if the service principal is logged on outside of the Netherlands. Now, this is a very simple rule. You can also make it a little bit more advanced. So the second part is, which I created, is the involving the threat intelligence. So what I did is in the threat intelligence section, let's see if I have it open. No. So in the threat intel section of Sentinel, you can have IP addresses or other indicators of compromise added manually or via APIs. Now for this test, I added an IP address, and basically what the rule does, I will share the rule later on. This is the rule I created. Is it will match the IP addresses in the threat intel list versus the sign-in logs from the service principal. And again, if a match is found, we get a TI map IP entity to AAD service principal alert. So this is a little bit more advanced, leveraging threat intel instead of locations outside of the Netherlands. Now, it's nice to detect stuff, but it's maybe even better to block things from happening. So with Azure AD Identity Protection, the policies, we have two user policies, the user risk and the sign-in risk. The user risk is a policy with now the risk level high, which means a compromised identity, remediate via a password change. User risk medium is often an anomaly, which we remediate by requiring an extra MFA challenge. For service principals, we don't have a policy yet. It might come in the future, but what we can do for now is create a conditional access policy. So going to the conditional access policy, we have now the option to, instead of user and groups, use workload identities. Now we want to use it for all cloud applications and with the condition. Dus if the service principal risk is high, we also saw that in the portal for the leak credentials, then we want to block access to the application. So quick demo on that. So I created a service principal, and if you want to log on again via PowerShell, what Raymond did and connected to some Azure resources, in here we cannot connect because access is blocked by a conditional access policy. One thing to keep in mind, each time you will use PowerShell connect to a service principal, it states here, data is shared of saved local to disk. So keep that in mind that if you go to the disk, open the file, you will see your credentials in clear text, also the secret on your disk. So there might be malicious people that also scan disk for this file if they can find credentials. So with that, that was my part of the presentation. And now we are going to the Q&A section. Thanks.
Thanks, Derk. And we see we have one question from Andreas about the user risk. Perhaps Etan or Winston, you can clarify a little bit. You can define a medium user risk. I never found when a user risk is medium. Is there an overview when a user risk is medium and when it is a high? And you already shared an article, but can you collaborate on this one? Are there any use cases related to medium?
Yeah, so the user risk, when we calculate the user risk using identity protection, it depends on the data and the detections that we have about the user. So we use, as Etan mentioned earlier, we use heuristics and machine learning to determine the user risk. I went and linked the doc as an example here, but there are cases where user risk can be medium just based on the information we have about the user and the detections that are fired about the user. So there isn't like one specific case where this specific action will always result in medium risk. At least that we're able to share at this time. But based off of the data we have, there are cases where user can be medium, high, and low, and the user risk should correspond to our confidence level and how confident we are that the user is compromised.
And maybe a little addition to that, what I noticed from my years of experience, that the user risk medium is 9 out of 10 times an anomaly. So a malicious IP address, an anonymous browser, etc. User risk low, to be honest, is mostly an environment anomaly. For example, an IP address that can be is malicious from a command control, for example. But if you are at an hotel with 1,000 people, it doesn't mean your machine is compromised, maybe one of the guests. The risk level high is 9 out of 10 times really compromised account. So really change the password as soon as possible. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if there are any other responses or questions.
Still people joining the call. Interesting. Maybe one remark in between. People that join the call the last 5 minutes, it will be recorded and shared on, I think, on YouTube tomorrow. So you can.
Okay, we receive some feedback. What happens when you have a CA rule for user risks scope to all users, but not all users have a license with the correct Azure AD premium license?
I think it's a good question. It is out of scope of the, because this is an E5 feature and you're talking about an E3 feature.
Not sure, Etan, do you know the license eligibility?
Yeah, so as of right now, we don't enforce tenant-wide licensing. The rule is you need to be licensed when you, for all the customers, excuse me, for all the users who have a risk-based policy applied to them. I think this is a P2 or an E5 license capability. But the way it stands today is if you have one P2 license in your environment of 100,000 employees, that's enough to set the policy, but you're out of compliance. In the future, we're looking into, enforcing this, but we haven't enforced it yet. Hopefully that answers your question.
To be more a compliance issue than a technical
right
capability. One more detailed question from Rolf. Is the risk also calculated based on authentication method? For instance, certificate-based, password, FIDO2. Yeah, that are those details which are part of the calculation machine, right?
I'll speak to the aspect of workload identities, and Winston, you can speak to users if you want. So for workload identities, one of the detections we have is suspicious sign-ins. And what we look for suspicious sign-ins, we baseline normal sign-in activity for up to it's going to be up to 180 days for that individual service principal and application. And then we're going to look for anomalies across several different factors. One of those factors is credential type. So if we see anomalies that include a new credential type, let's say you have an application that normally authenticates with an X509 certificate, and then all of a sudden it starts authenticating with a secret. That's going to be an anomaly. Now, probably we're going to have to see other anomalies beyond just that, because that by itself might not be enough evidence of compromise. But those are one of the factors that we'll take into account when we calculate risk for this particular account. Winston, any comments on the user side?
Yeah, so we see kind of the same behavior on the user side, where different types of different detections we fire can affect your risk at higher severities. For example, if we find we have a user detection called leak credential, where we see your password, like if your password has been found online in online repository. And so when we see that type of detection, usually we fire that as a high risk detection, because your password being obviously in a online is considered a high risk action. So on the user side, we have many different detections as mentioned here, and some detections that are known to be very risky will automatically be fired as a high risk detection, and that will affect the user risk at that state, such as your password being found online.
Thanks, Winston. Done. Well, it seems there are no questions anymore, which will bring us to the end of this session. So people, if you have additional questions or feedback or other comments, please let us know by sending a direct message to the Netscaper account on LinkedIn, or get in touch via our socials or website. Subscribe yourself to the Netscaper YouTube channel. Thomas provided already the URL to the YouTube channel. And we will share the recording there, and also make a note in the chat on LinkedIn. Special thanks to Etan and Winston. Thank you guys for joining today and share new information about the identity protection. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you back in our next Netscaper webinar. Thank you guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.